So we've talked about how parents, in a different module, we've talked about how parents can bring this developmental relational approach to their own children. We've talked about how the developmental relational approach can benefit teachers and students in classrooms. I want to talk a little bit about what we can do as a society to help create and support those programs that really benefit children and by extension families and by extension, I guess, all of us. And once again, you have a very consistent sort of guiding principle when it comes to these programs and to children. You say, and I'm quoting you here, interventions can be best understood as accelerating development. And I know we've covered that in previous modules, but can you explain again what you mean by accelerating development?
Be glad to, and I think let's pull it up to a societal level if we're talking about the larger picture. There are children and youth in our society who, for many reasons, both biological and environmental, haven't been able to develop the capacities and the neural pathways to enable them to function at in an age-appropriate way. And they need help catching up to their peers in the truest sense of the word. And we can identify these children at many points in development, in early childhood, as they come through the door of kindergarten, as they transition to middle school, during elementary school, transitioning to middle school, entering high school. And at each of these points, there's an opportunity to say, this young person is really behind in some critical skills. And the interventions that are effective are ones that understand or focus on the mechanisms that enable children to develop the capacities that they need. So let's take an example. Let's talk about the SNAP program that the Child Development Institute has developed and is now throughout North America and in Europe as well. The skills that they've identified as lacking in these children are the self-regulation skills. And we talked about that in terms of the neuropsychology research with these children. Their brains just haven't developed the neural pathways that enable them to use their executive functioning, to monitor themselves, to calm themselves down, and be less emotional. So in that program, that's what they focus on, that they push the children's development forward by doing a lot of work, a lot of role-playing, a lot of self-awareness around body signals to enable the children to develop this self-regulation. And as I mentioned, what the EEG data suggests, what the brain data suggests, is that these children are developing the neural pathways that haven't been developed. So the intervention in 12 weeks is accelerating the development that would have occurred over several years, in fact. So the earlier you can get in and support a child, the better. But I don't think it's too late at any point to start building these social and emotional capacities that all of us need.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, when we think about implementing a program, be it a community-based program or a school-based program, one of the hallmarks of a good or potentially successful program, you believe, is that it has this developmental approach, that it looks at increasing a child's capacity for self-regulation. What are some of the other things as we go about helping communities, helping voters, helping people as just good citizens decide which programs to support? What else should they be looking for in addition to this developmental perspective?
Well, it might not surprise you that I'm going to say we need a relational perspective at exactly the same time. So the SNAP program focuses on both the children who are in a 12-week program and a parallel program for their parents to really help their parents learn how to regulate, understand their behavior, become more effective in raising their children in a non-punitive, harsh way, but a more relational way. That being said, The SNAP program also works within classrooms. So when a really disruptive child is in a classroom, the peer dynamics in that classroom exacerbate the problems that the child has. And if the teacher isn't supported in understanding the child developmentally and approaching that child in a positive way, the teacher can inadvertently also exacerbate the problems. So we look at not only the child and shifting the development of the child, but ensuring that the relationships that that child's growing up in are what we would consider healthy relationships. The child feels valued and supported and can cope with the inevitable stresses that are coming from just living. And just as importantly, that those relationships aren't adding stress to that child's life. And peers can add stress, parents can add stress, teachers can add stress. And what we want to do is try to help those others think about how they can ensure that that child is as successful as he or she can be in the work they're doing to regulate.
So I'm going to keep adding to our growing list here. So if I'm hearing you correctly, the kind of programs we should be supporting are developmental. They focus on relationships. They aren't just focusing on the development of children or students. They're focusing on the development of the adults in their lives, if they're parents, if they're teachers. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about the SNAP program before. I know about it. And I want to ask you about an aspect of it that has sometimes in our world been controversial, and that's assessments. So, you know, SNAP does use assessments. Am I correct?
You are, because if we go back to those binoculars that we talked about in terms of one lens focusing on the development of the child and the other lens focusing on the nature of relationships that that child's experiencing and trying to support healthy relationships, we have a sense of, you know, how the child's doing, but not really, you know, which children specifically would benefit from the program, because perhaps some children don't need to benefit, and perhaps some children and families just aren't ready for programming. So the group at SNAP, Lena Ajameri and others who've worked with her, have developed the Early Assessment Risk List. And the EARLs, as they're called, enable clinicians through work with child and family and a lot of interviewing and assessment to not only identify the strengths and weaknesses of a child, particular child, and where that child might need the scaffolding that we talked about, but also the family context and even the community context. And the final thing they think about and assess on the EARL is the extent to which the family's ready for this type of treatment. And maybe they need something before they're going to be ready. Maybe they need stable housing. You know, maybe the parents need a little support in terms of their relationship, or the mother needs a little bit of support if she's a single mom in terms of, you know, organizing the complexity of her life. So it's also about, will they be able to get to the program? Are they ready to take the program? And I think that's important to consider, both at a family level and at a community level. And I've had the opportunity with Breaking the Cycle to do some work around interpersonal violence for women who have children 0 to 6. And we could choose from 834 community organizations in Canada that offered early childhood centers. And so we did this kind of screening for communities to see whether they were ready to do this type of work. And their readiness, just to fill in the blank there, their readiness had to do with, did they understand there was family violence in the community? Did they have a link to women's counseling and shelter services? The types of supports that would be needed when you're talking to women about their experience of violence in relationships.
You know, personally, I absolutely believe in assessments. I recognize, or I believe I recognize their power in helping us understand where we need to deploy resources and what the actual issues are. The critics of assessments, though, I have a certain amount of compassion for their argument that we sometimes assess, in particular, assess a youth, and we then fate them to a certain track.
I agree with those critics. I agree that labels are really difficult for children. And in my writing, in my scientific writing, I don't ever identify children as bullies or victims. I focus on the behavior. Children engaged in bullying, children experiencing victimization, because I think the labels constrain the child, but more than that, they constrain the adults working with that child. And so you say, well, this child's a bully, and it's like, oh, I got to keep my eye out for that kid. You know, it's always going to be a problem, and so when that child, for example, experiences victimization, the teacher goes, well, what did you do to deserve that? And the labels are helpful, but they're very constraining in terms of particularly how we as psychologists think of them and use them. And I've had the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now, and the labels don't work for them. That's not how they see the world. That's not how they see children and raise their children. And I'm sure that's true in other cultures as well. This is a very Western approach. So I think it's time to challenge that. And you think about children coming through the door of kindergarten. It doesn't take very long for a skilled teacher to observe children and see which children are causing disruption, which children aren't able to sit and attend, which children are maybe hungry coming through the door. And those are really important observations and strategies for assessment as well.
So in our ever-expanding list of what to look for in a positive program, we have they need to be developmental, they need to focus on relationships, they need to not just be supportive of the students or the children in them, but they need to support the adults that are in that child's life, be it teachers or be it parents. They need to have assessments so we know what the needs of the classroom or the home or the child or the parents or the teachers are. There's another word that you use that I think has everything to do with your experience working with Indigenous communities. You talk about making sure that the child is a co-creator. Explain what that means.
Yeah. You know, when you think about moving through the world and moving through life, agency is a really important thing, like feeling like you have the capacity to do what you want to do, engage with people, engage with the activities that you're interested in. And so with children and youth, as we support them and try to figure out what's going to work for them, what's going to be interesting for them and engaging for them as we create intervention experiences, they should be there helping us understand that. And the UN Convention on Rights of the Child is very clear on the importance of child voice, child participation, youth participation in decision-making, a fulsome education for children. There are many guiding principles that say these are full human beings and they can participate fully in thinking about what's going to help them and what's not going to help them. They're pretty aware of that as well. Sitting in the corner, going home and being suspended for 3 days playing video games, they probably could tell you quite quickly that that's not doing much to move them forward. So I think listening to youth, honoring them, they're the experts in their own life, is a really important strategy for us, at a level of the community program or the classroom, but more generally, I think youth have a lot to say about where our countries are going and what's ahead of them in the future. And I think their voice is really important as we make decisions for the next 10 or 20 years for our country, because they'll be the adults who are in charge then.
It strikes me also that keeping allowing, affording the children of the students a role as co-creator also protects people like me from being saviors, from wanting to rush in and think that, with hopefully an honest desire to help, to impose something on a group or a population, rather than support them in a way that they want to be supported. Am I right in believing that?
I think as a professor, as those of us who work in this area and spend our lives doing research in this area to try to figure out the answers, there's a real sense that we can go in with the answers. Like our research that's been based on, thousands of young people giving us information, and then we're sorting it through, that we've got that right. And I've had the amazing experience for the last almost 40 years of being embedded in community clinical educational programs. And boy, that's taught me a lot. It's taught me that I don't know what I don't know, and that I need to listen to those who are on the ground every day and be quite humble in sharing my research and my understanding, but also listening to what they know works. And so I think that works with both the children and youth, certainly at Breaking the Cycle, this program for substance using women that I've been involved with. The women guide the program, and we listen very carefully to what they say, and they're really surprised when they see the changes we make based on their expertise.
Yeah. Well, it is often the case that the programs get prescribed at a very high level, and then you're asked to implement them in a very broad and very different populations. And sometimes, and I know that you've written about this is part of your experience, you are asked by a population that isn't yours, that you don't share their experience, you don't share their geography, you don't share their background, but you're asked by that population to come in and to lend your expertise. I've heard you say that the first thing you do is listen. What other advice do you have for people who are being asked to bring programs to work in communities that aren't their own?
I think there again, you need a humble and relational approach to that. And by and large, I think listening is the best strategy, but also doing your own learning, because it's not their responsibility to teach you. They have enough work to do, that it's not their responsibility to teach you about their culture, about their worldviews and their ways of life. So a lot of reading, a lot of even reading the literature, the stories from those communities, whether they're Black communities, I've worked in Indigenous communities, but also stepping back and giving room for them to lead. And I think when we come in, it's quite interesting, when we come in as researchers or interveners or scientists, practitioners, we have a limited number of tools in our pockets. And I've learned this especially with the Indigenous communities, like they need some supports, there's no question of that, but they know the way they need to move forward, and their journey is self-determined. So with some supports and scaffolding and resources and tools, they can move forward. But I've no idea, what their journey is. And what's so interesting across Turtle Island, which is what we now call North America, is that every community is different,
right.
And their stories are different, their history is different, the traumas they've experienced, and so their journey will be different. And no one from the outside can come and dictate that. And nor if we go in for 2 or 3 days and just offer some workshops or training, it's not going to be sustained. So you need to be a follower in this case rather than the leader out front.
You and I were talking, outside of this interview, and I know there's an idea that you've been toying with that has to do with something that both of you and I have talked about how it's not just these programs that we implement that are impacting the kids, not the classrooms, but there's myriad ways that the things that we vote on, the laws that we pass impact children. And we were talking, for example, about how sentencing guidelines for adults impact children, or about how harm reduction strategies in opioid treatment can harm or help children. And you've been, I think, toying with this idea of what we can learn from environmental impact statements.
I have, and I think that we're working collectively as a society, as you know, as a world, to address the critical issue of climate change. And in order to do that, when legislation comes through and new policies are brought in, there's generally an assessment of the extent to which this new mine, this new carbon capture program, whatever it is going to impact the environment. And it's a very broad assessment of the flora and the fauna and the waste and the humans, and it's important because we've made so many mistakes that we don't want to make those mistakes again. I think the same thing holds true for children and youth. I think that we need to really shift our attitudes about children and youth, that they're not just little human beings that we move in and out of institutions like schools and get them ready to be full human beings. That they're full human beings as soon as they enter the world. And as we think about policies and legislation, I think we need to do a child-based assessment. To what extent is this legislation going to promote children's healthy development or in any way impact that? And it makes me think of the Hippocratic Oath that physicians take, that they do no harm. And certainly that's what we think about as psychologists as well, that you do not want to go in and do harm. And sometimes we do, and you need to check that quite quickly. I think if we move that principle up to what we think about as a society, we need to ensure that we're not doing harm. An example of that might be, let's increase every classroom to be 40 children. 40 children isn't the problem. Is there enough space for 40 children? Are there 4 adults in that classroom? 4 caring, well-trained, highly respected adults in that classroom so that they can give the level of attention to those children? So if not, those children, many of them will do well. Others will fall by the wayside and be caught in that developmental lag that we were talking about. So I think we need to think about and maybe develop instruments to screen for the impact of legislation on children.
Well, I think it goes back to why you and I are interested even in metacognition, because if we attached to every new piece of legislation this idea that you have to at least identify or give time to think about how it might impact children, well, then you're at the very least thinking about children. You're not ignoring them. And we know there are so many failed policies in the United States. The war on drugs that was designed to stop people from using illegal narcotics became a war on families because we were breaking families apart. We were creating vulnerable children because we had locked up members of their family. We had given no attention to what a harsh sentence was going to mean to the child in that situation. But I could easily see a child assessment applying to whether or not we change a speed limit on a road, right? Where we put this power plant, like you said. So I think it's a really, really interesting idea.
So it's been helpful for me to be on the ground in programs and also sort of working at a national level with a national research network. And the work on the ground really helps me understand that. So there was concern in the mid-90s that many women who were using substances had children who were being born with substances in their bodies, and that this was just so awful for the children and the potential of those children to develop in a healthy way. But the program that was developed by Margaret Leslie and others at Breaking the Cycle said, okay, we have the mother as one of the focus of our intervention, but the child is the focus of the intervention too. We want healthy development for that child. But the third client, so to speak, is the mother-child relationship, because that's the context for healthy development for the children, for really surrounding that mother with support and enabling her to develop the capacities that she needs to parent in the way that she wants to. So it's a very wraparound support program. And your reference to, criminalization and jailing of people who use illegal substances is one that comes forward in the center.
Yeah.
And instead, because many of the women have parole officers, and instead of sending these women and their very young children into a parole office where many people have engaged in criminal behavior, the parole officer comes to the center and meets the women in a really safe space, meets the women where their child is in a care facility with others whom she trusts. So it changes things, and I think that program should be in every community in the country.
Well, I mean, and I just like the shift from recognizing that when society is deciding for whatever reason, and I might not agree with it, but they've decided that they are going to punish this person for whatever transgression there is, that at the very least we should think about whom else is being punished. And if it's a child, we at least need to acknowledge that there is an innocent person in this equation that did nothing wrong and that they're being punished in a very harsh way. I know that there are people who might listen to this and they might hear you, suggesting new regulations that we put in place to govern industries that are outside of education, these other spheres that we tend to think of as being more closely related to children and families. And they are opposed to regulations because regulations cost money. But in your research and in the types of programs that you've advocated for, you've seen a tremendous return on those investments. Tell me a little bit about that.
I would like to talk about that. There's a field that's emerged with really clever thinkers around, if we put $1 in here, early intervention.
Yeah.
If we get the problem early and invest $1 here, how much do we save down the road in terms of costs for society, costs for the individual, costs for the close relationships in that individual's in, but also costs for society. And the work at the SNAP program, it was initially set up to keep kids in school and out of jail.
Yeah.
And so what is the cost of running this program for 12 weeks? And sometimes families need more. They need family sessions after that. The highest risk children need family sessions and a befriending model. They do really much better when there's a caring adult who works with them in the context of the community activities. What is the cost of all of that? And then the cost savings. And within the SNAP program, they've been able to get the justice records and look for the youth who've been in the program and see whether they've had crimes at the rate that would be expected for them if they hadn't had the program. And what they find in different analyses is that the return on investment, which is what it's called, you invest $1, the return on investment is $32 saved for every $1 that you put in. So it's huge. Like, that's a good return. We're just in the process of doing that for Breaking the Cycle. But in a very sort of moderate way, I asked Margaret Leslie, who heads the program, how much does it cost for a family to be in this program for 1 year? And a family means a mother and 1 or 2 or perhaps even more children. And she did the calculations. There are 12 staff in the program. She did all the calculations, and she said, Deb, it's about $3,400 to have a family in the program for a year. Because a lot of the supports are community supports that come in, and food banks that offer food, etc. And then you start to think about, well, what are the cost savings? And this is where we're talking right now. So that the mothers are doing better, and with a year, 2 years, 3 years in the program, they're often out in education or starting a job or stabilizing and taking care of their children. They're doing better. And the children are doing much better in terms of their development, their neurodevelopment. Several of my graduate students have looked at that. And the children's cognitive development and social emotional development is much better than you would expect. And so they are much less likely to struggle in school. And if they're less likely to struggle holistically in school in terms of the academic, but also the social and emotional aspects of schooling, they're much less likely to end up in delinquency and much less likely to mature to adult crime and go on, and more likely on the other side to be employed, to finish school, to be employed, to have a family, to contribute to the community. So there's this balance sheet that you look at, but the return on $3,400 or maybe $6,800 if it's over 2 years, is huge, huge. And I think we need to start thinking long term, even though our election cycles aren't designed long term. I think we need to stop and say, we're all working for the children and youth and adults and families in our communities. How do we do this in a long-term, really sensible way?
Well, and of course the Heckman equation, the Nobel Prize winning economist, and he's also tried, if I'm not mistaken, tried to account for the health cost savings, because we know, and we've discussed this in other modules, how regulated individuals live longer lives, are healthier, require fewer health and mental health services as well. So I think that the numbers that you've cited before, if anything, are conservative, right? But it does go back to a shift in thinking, because you just said, in you kind of wrapping up your thoughts about it and the thoughts about the election cycle, what is this doing, putting the children and families at the center of it? But I don't see that at the center of the debates right now. And so that child assessment, I think, is an important step.
Yeah, what if we just asked, as governments are putting in policies and developing, all legislation, what if we just asked, what is the child and youth impact of this? What is the healthy development impact of this? And it may be very positive, but on the other hand, it may cause harm.
So in addition to these other characteristics of the programs that you're advocating for, in addition to them being developmentally focused, to focus on relationships, to support the children and students that are in them, the teachers and the adults that are in them, right? That they make the youth and students co-creators in the experience. There's another kind of term that is present in a lot of your writing. You talk about strength-based. Why do you advocate also that these programs be strength-based, and what does that even mean?
I think a program that is strength-based starts on the assumption that whoever walks through the door of your program and starts to do it has a range of strengths that they're bringing to the program that you can recognize and build on. The other aspect of it is that in the work you do through an intervention, you're creating strengths. You're creating the strengths that a child or youth or parent or teacher needs to move forward and operate effectively. But it's even more than that, because it's a shift away from a focus on what's wrong. And when we think about what's wrong with this child, he acts out, he's disruptive, he's difficult in the class, she's mean, the immediate response to that is like, well, how do we stop that behavior? And we stop it by punishing it. And that, it's not that there shouldn't be consequences, but the consequences should always be formative. And what I mean by that is they should always be consequences that teach the child or the parent, or whomever, how to do it differently, and how to sort of step into that difficult space in a way that is going to be more effective. And the other thing is, when you punish a child or a youth, or you criticize a parent or blame a parent, you create distance in the relationship. So it's, again, developmental and relational. You create distance in that relationship. You're judging them. They're feeling shame and embarrassment or anger or guilt. And you've just, in creating that distance, you've just undermined your very goal of ensuring that that person can respond to the intervention that you've done. Because somebody who feels shamed and blamed and punished and distanced isn't going to stand there and say, I'm going to work my hardest to do the things you want me to do, whether it's a parent or a child or a youth. And so it shifts the lens from saying, what's wrong with this child, to, what has this child not yet developed? What has the child developed that are really strengths? Or, in some sense, it's also a strength to look at the adaptiveness that we talked about earlier, that children, living beings, adapt to the context in which they're growing. And so children who live in a home or a school context where they're always neglected and not seen and not understood or supported will learn to act out, to find connection. And they get it. It works to do that. And it's not really, in the long term, it's not helpful, but in the moment it gets them connection. The adult turns to them and pays attention to them, and they feel seen again. So it's pretty smart to figure that out. And so it's just flipping the coin from saying, what's wrong with this child, what's wrong with this family, to saying, there are a lot of strengths here. And where there aren't such strengths, where there's some needs and challenges, I can build strengths. And so it's focused on, that building capacity in whatever domain it is.
I like that so much because I think that it relates to some other really good science, some that we've already discussed in other modules for this. That if we first focus on the strength, we're already changing how we think about the child in the program. We've talked about that. We've also talked about how strength breeds success. We know that if somebody feels competent in one domain, they're more likely to take risks and develop in a different domain and use those skills. So I really like both of those. But I also have to imagine that it really helps in the other concept that you discussed of the co-creation, because the child really feels seen if their strengths get recognized. But then also, finally, it has to make a person in a program, in a classroom, in a family, feel safer to be reminded of their strengths. Because I know oftentimes, especially if they're starting a new program, starting a new school year, that they're surrounded by new adults, maybe in a strange environment, that can seem very frightening.
Yeah. goes back to our early discussions
Yeah.
of attachment
Yeah.
and feeling safe and secure in relationships, because if you don't feel safe, you don't risk, because there's no secure place to come back to. It also made me think about our discussion of 10 positives to every negative.
Absolutely.
You know, that if a child is living in a context where there's constant criticism and you're focusing on everything that they're doing wrong, and you know, as children learn, they do things wrong because that's how they learn. The child doesn't feel supported, and if you can shift that and give the child 10 positives, which means recognizing their strengths, to every one of those criticisms, the criticism lands softly. It lands softly because the child knows that the adult cares about them and sees them and does their strength. I just want to give you a little story, if that's okay. I had an opportunity almost 20 years ago to spend time in Alaska with 100 Native American leaders. It was just a gift. And I decided what the best thing for me to do would be to sit with the elders at lunchtime, to go and find an elder and just go and sit beside them and then listen to them. And I sat beside a man who identified himself as U-Pick. And we talked. And my question to him was, how do you raise your children in a way that might be different to the Western ways that we raise our children? And he looked at me and he went, and he thought for a minute. And he said to me, the biggest difference between the way we raise our children and you raise your children in Western society is that we honor children's mistakes. He said, let me give you an example. He said, we teach our children to harness the dogs for the dog sled. And if a child doesn't harness the dog right, it gives me the very best opportunity to step in that moment and show the child how to do it right. It's right there in the moment. I can do it in a caring way. And we look for and honor children when they make mistakes. It shifted my thinking, that one piece of wisdom from that man. Because what if we changed our legislation, and I know very well the legislation in my province because I helped develop it, around how to deal with children who have social emotional behavior problems, which means they grew up in a context that wasn't able to support their development to the point where they were ready to go to school. Instead of saying, you're acting out, go and sit on that chair at the back of the room, and isolating, what if we taught them social emotional behavior, honored their mistakes? Oh, they're really struggling. Wonder what I can do to make a difference for that child. And then honor their mistakes by breaking it down, like saying, here's how you harness the dog. Here's how you take a deep breath. Here's how you think, oh, that was an accident. That person probably didn't mean to knock my pencil off my desk. Here's how you take another deep breath and think about how to respond. Like if we broke down the learning of social emotional behavior the way we do for reading and math, then it would be a big difference. We would honor children's mistakes and they would learn better, especially those children at the margins.
If I may, Deb, I see something else in his example, and that is the importance of teaching a skill at the moment when you need it. And I forget who shared this analogy with me, but it's one that I find works so well, and that is I could put together a wonderful PowerPoint on how to change a tire. You could have great graphics, great examples, and you might study it. I might be a great teacher standing in front of the classroom teaching you how to change a tire. But if I teach you how to change a tire when you're pulled over at the side of the road and it's raining, you're really going to learn how to change a tire. So making sure that we learn those skills at the moment when we need them, which I think is in that example of harnessing up the dogs.
Yeah. That, you know, I appreciate that example, and I think about it a lot in terms of our education system, because I think our system's broken in many ways, and I know teachers and principals work as hard as they can, but But not all of us need all of the things that we're teaching children and youth. Yeah, they're basics. Certainly in the early years and through elementary and middle school, there's some real basics that all of us need for living life. But there's some high-level differences in terms of, high-level math, high-level science, high-level geography, or English. It doesn't matter. But maybe we ought to again, listen to children and youth and find out what they're interested in and enable them to choose a little bit more about, what they're interested in. People might say, oh, but they'll miss out on calculus. How do you possibly live life without calculus? And I think you actually can. And if you
I hope so.
you need it, I do too. I didn't take it. If you need it, you can go back and get it.
Yeah.
But I think if education could be a bit more aligned with what it is that children need, and I know they need social emotional capacities, and when they need it, and what their vision is for where they're going and what they see they need.
There's one other element of a program that we haven't addressed, and I'm surprised given your history, and I'm surprised given my history, and that is the importance of the staff in that program.
Yes, yes. Taking care of children has often been relegated to like babysitting, and taking care of children in a school is specialized babysitting, and it's really not. And those of us who study children's development and study their brain development, study what goes right, study what goes wrong, which often helps us understand it, recognize that to be effective and attuned and instructive, for lack of a better word, in a relationship with the child, whether it's in daycare or primary school or middle school or high school, takes a tremendous amount of skill. And I think particularly the developmental lens, that you really need to understand what's happening for the child developmentally, like where are their strengths that you can build on and celebrate? Where are they really tripping up and struggling and haven't yet had the scaffolding to get them there? And I was going to just stop there, and then I realized that the relational piece is equally important, because the questions you need to ask yourself as an adult and be trained to ask yourself as a staff member, whatever you are in the context, is what am I doing that's enabling this child to do well? And what might I be doing inadvertently that's making it difficult for this child? And it might be your tone of voice. It might be the fact that you only see when the child's doing things wrong and never seem to acknowledge the child when they're doing things right. So I think working with children and youth is a highly, highly skilled job. And it's interesting, because if we take a look at Finland, which about 30 years ago did a huge revamp of its education system, teachers are the most highly regarded professionals in the country. In the country. They're paid very well. It's really hard to get into teacher education, and they're recognized as the most important profession in the country. I would wish that our teachers were celebrated in that way. I would wish that our resources and our funding went to ensuring that there were adequate numbers of adults with a group of children who were able to, yes, support the children who are doing well, but ensure that the children who are at the margins because of neurodiversity, because of behavior problems, are able to function optimally in that situation and enjoy their peer relationships, enjoy the curiosity of learning, and feel that they belong and they matter in that context.
To your point, the people that I've known that are really skilled at working with kids, either in a classroom or in another program, they prepare like elite athletes. They take care of their own physical and mental health, and they're constantly training. It's not like they got a degree and then never went back to a book. The people that I respect the most are always getting better. They're always staying on top of it. And they're doing some of the things that we've recommended that you've recommended in these other modules about always looking at their own thinking, always assessing their own physical presence, their own mindset. So it is so much work. And we need to, it is. And to your point, we need to really support them in doing it.
We do. And that goes back to the policy. It goes back to, so if we were really going to make things different for our country and ensure that every child growing up is able to be successful, however that's defined, and it's defined differently for all children and youth, and then emerge into adulthoods and have fulfilling lives, we need to prioritize the well-being of children and youth and those who care for them. And that would be a very big shift. It would mean not prioritizing financial gains as much and focusing more on quality. And it's interesting because our country's struggling with productivity. Canada's struggling with productivity, and the front page of our national paper has articles on that all the time. And, I keep looking at that, and, we need better machines, and we need, investment in more machines. And I think, wait a minute, productivity is how much an individual is able to do in a given hour of a given workday. And if you back that up and think, well, how do we develop individuals, citizens who are going to do that? The focus comes on children and youth and families and the organizations and institutions that support them. So it's, again, the trouble about it is it's long term. You invest in the children today because they're going to be highly productive and engaged and happy in the work that they do, whatever it is, 20 years down the road. So these are thorny issues that we're talking about.
One of the ways that well, let me put it in the form of a question. How can we tell, especially if you're a layperson, how can you tell whether or not this program that's being proposed for your community, for your school, has all of those elements and is using them effectively?
Thank you for asking this question, Brad. I'm a researcher. I've spent my entire career researching programs and researching the effectiveness of programs. And program evaluation is so important, and yet it doesn't get the attention it should. I think that anybody choosing a program should look at the evidence that program has of its effectiveness. And the best way to do that is to see in what's called a randomized controlled trial, where some people get the program, and others don't get it, and those two groups, by chance ended up there, and you see how they function. We can't always do that. For sure we can't look at women who finally decided to come through the door of a treatment center and say to them, I'm flipping a coin. Oh, I'm sorry, you don't get that. So we need to look at what kinds of evaluation are possible, but there should be evidence that the program is effective, not just in the short term, not right at the end of the program, but longer, and lays down those skills that children need for life. And it's okay if it's not effective 3 months, 6 months, or a year out. It gives you really important information. And we often learn from things that aren't effective. And the information that it gives you is that we can't just say, oh, I've done 12 weeks of training and it's done. We need to say, those families, those children and families need ongoing support. What kind of booster sessions can we do? It won't cost us too much to do that. And let's be sure, and then we'll know which families need extra, and we can pull them back in and give them extra support, and which ones are just flying ahead and doing well. So it's interesting. How do you, as an organization or a group, decide which programs you should choose. You look at the evidence. I think you've started to develop a checklist of things that should be in programs, that developmental perspective, a relational perspective, training the adults. I can tell you the worst example I've ever seen, because like sometimes you learn from things that are
Very
worst.
true.
Okay. So I was on the Safe Schools Action Team here in Ontario, and they were addressing the issues of bullying. And they decided they would give every school board money to buy programs for bullying. And if you have a developmental relational perspective, you know that the solution to bullying doesn't come in a box or in a binder. It actually comes from changing relationships, because bullying is a relationship problem and it needs relationship solutions. So they gave money out to, it was written in the legislation that this money would go out to school boards. And then they sent out a wide notice. And then they said, if you have a bullying program, let us know, and we will put it on our list. And so there were like 120 bullying programs, Bob's Bust the Bully, programs that have no evidence, have a fancy, aggressive title and bashing bullying.
Yeah.
And they were all on the list, and we did a review of it, and about 10% of the programs had any evidence that they worked. And my guess is that many of the programs would be what we call iatrogenic. And it goes back to that do no harm. They actually made things worse. And that is just unacceptable. And if you don't study a program to look at those effects that make things worse, then you need to back up and not be doing what you're doing.